So Mr. Lippman's AP Government PowerPoint on bureaucracy that I found on the internet and I'm using. Mr. Lippman doesn't like it. He can let me know and I will take it down. So keys to the fourth branch, the bureaucracy. Since it links all three branches together, it is sometimes referred to as the fourth branch, although technically it's part of the executive branch. And it carries out public policy, which is why it says policy is key. All right, so spoil system. One of the things we learned is that historically, before the Pendleton Act and the civil service system, the spoil system was the primary way of determining who had a job in the federal bureaucracy. However, the federal bureaucracy during that time period was not particularly large. Garfield was assassinated. This freaked out a lot of political leaders. They passed the Pendleton Act, which created a merit system for determining who would get a job in the bureaucracy, a civil service system, which about 90% of all federal workers today are involved in. You take tests, and you have to have certain qualifications, certain degrees, and so on, in order to have a chance to get the job. So let's get into different elements of the bureaucracy. Commissions. The ICC was the first, created to end price fixing by the railroads. The large rise in federal workers during the Depression and LBJ's war on poverty. What are we saying there? Because of the New Deal plans of FDR and LBJ's war on poverty, which goes into the Great Society projects, you have this massive increase in the size of the federal bureaucracy. And what happened? Great Depression's a crisis. What happened with LBJ's war on poverty? A social change, the 60s. So this increases jobs, increased presidential power. The Hatch Act, which was passed in 1939, was designed to reduce government workers' involvement in politics, but it was weakened in 1993. Still, there are certain things that as a federal worker you cannot do politically. Analyzing visuals, federal employees in the executive branch. This line graph tracks the number of federal employees in the executive branch of the U.S. government from the 18th to the 21st century. And it says review the figure and then answer the question. So let's look here. 1789, moving forward, first federal departments inherited the state, treasury, and war. And you see the number of millions of workers, and it's a very small number. Notice the increase around World War I, and then the increase as a result of the New Deal plan, and then World War II. Drop off after World War II, and then LBJ's Great Society program. Government workers and political involvement. The Hatch Act of 1939 prohibits civil servants from taking activist roles in partisan campaigns. Federal employees cannot make political contributions, work for a particular party, or campaign for a particular candidate. The Federal Employees Political Activities Act of 1993 liberalizes the Hatch Act. Federal employees can run for office in nonpartisan elections and contribute money to campaigns in partisan elections. So what does that mean? That means they can run for dog catcher, for example, or mayor. The cabinet departments, there are 15. Homeland Security is the most recent. All but senior people are civil service merit system hires. The cabinet heads, the secretaries, or in the case of the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, are appointed by President and confirmed by Senate, but are responsible to their departments. This phrase about how they adopt the culture of their department is called going native. And then brings up a simple point. Each of those departments has its own culture, its own way of viewing its role, and so on. The FBI has a very different take on how to be in the FBI as, say, somebody in the Department of State has to be in the Department of State. Some departments are actually clientele agencies. They promote the interests of a given group. For example, the Department of Agriculture, Department of Education, Department of Veterans Affairs. Implementation is the process by which a policy or law will be actually put into operation by the agency. And we've talked about the example of implementation concerning literacy for naturalization, for someone to become a citizen of the United States. Now they implement Congress's rules concerning literacy being a requirement, and that the agency came up with 4th grade. That's implementation. 4 different types of oversight. Government corporations, businesses established by Congress to perform a function that otherwise would be done by private businesses. FDIC, or TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, or Post Office, or Amtrak. Hopefully you all know the FDIC insures your money to a certain amount that you have in the bank in case the bank collapses. So it's basically an insurance system. Independent executive agencies. These usually perform services, not regulatory functions, often very specialized, and they don't fit very neatly into anything else. NASA, the EPA, the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, GSA, SBA, independent regulatory commissions created to regulate a specific economic activity or interest. The Securities Exchange Commission, or the Federal Reserve, or the Federal Communications Commission, etc. Cabinet posts, there are 15 of them. Example, Treasury. So which agency provides electricity to millions of Americans at reduced rates? The Tennessee Valley Authority. This goes back to FDR's time period. It was a way to electrify rural parts of rural Tennessee and some other states because there just wasn't enough money for private businesses to get involved in it. Iron triangles, a combination of agencies, congressional committees, and interest groups. The result of all these decision-making bodies is policy-making. It's recently becoming known as issue networks, but some textbooks make a distinction between issue networks and iron triangles and argue that an iron triangle is essentially a situation where an agency is captured and it serves as a monopoly. And this connection, this issue network that's an iron triangle, is a monopoly that closes other people out and controls policy in that area, whereas an issue network is more free-flowing and there's more competition between different interest groups, etc. So what is an iron triangle? Here you see a bureaucratic agency, interest groups, lobbyists, large corporations, congressional committees, subcommittees, and staff. How do they work? They're tools of bureaucratic agencies with which they round up support for their initiatives. Tools of Congress used to round up support for their initiatives. The relationship structure among bureaucratic agencies, interest groups, and congressional committees. Places in the bureaucratic hierarchy that keep employees in lower level positions, and overwhelmingly unconstitutional bureaucratic tools. All right, so I think Mr. Lippman has strong feelings about iron triangles. And by unconstitutional, really, I think a better term for it would be extra-constitutional. In other words, it's not in the Constitution. It's not really... When we use the word unconstitutional, we're usually referring to something the Supreme Court has decided you can't do. So we need to be careful with the wording of unconstitutional. And here, the relationship structure among bureaucratic agencies, interest groups, and congressional committees. Okay, so he's got... Making agencies accountable, executive control, executive orders. So the president has the power to make executive orders to order essentially agencies to do certain things. Congressional control. How does Congress exercise control over agencies? Through their constitutional authority, through passing laws, through funding, through oversight hearings. So oversight hearings, what does that mean? They can form committees and they can require leadership in agencies to report to them and tell them what's going on. Judicial control, judges can issue injunctions, orders for an agency to stop doing something or in order to make the agency do something in very select, specific issues. So what's the difference between police patrol oversight and fire alarm oversight? Police patrol oversight is proactive and fire alarm oversight is reactive. So what they're getting at is when they're investigating, they're looking into something just routinely, just checking on it. That's police patrol. If there's a problem and then they start looking into it, for example, right now the Republicans in the House have set up a committee to investigate the Benghazi incident. That would be fire alarm oversight. Congressional oversight is attached. That's where you get the term investigatory powers. Congress's power to oversee is its power to investigate. So investigatory and oversight are kind of synonyms here. Power of the purse. Congress has power to change the funding for agencies. This is how they can exercise a lot of influence. Through the General Accounting Office and the Congressional Budget Office, they can analyze the spending habits of an agency. They can determine how much the agency needs. They could even decide to not give the agency as much as it needs just to prove a point if they wanted to. The appointment process. The presidents appoint top-level leaders in the bureaucracy. However, it requires the Senate's consent. The enactment of laws. Again, they can change the law, which would change the rules that the bureaucracy has to follow. And abolishment power. They could basically pass a law to get rid of a particular agency. Key terms: administrative discretion. This is the power of an agency to use discretion in certain places, in certain areas, to make decisions. Since laws are usually not very specific and clear-cut on all things, it gives wiggle room for bureaucrats to make decisions about how to handle a situation. Administrative adjudication. Bureaucracies have something called quasi-judicial and quasi-legislative powers. In other words, there are regulations that agencies make that have the force of law, and you can get in trouble and have to pay fines and stuff like that. And the agencies are the ones to decide whether you get in trouble or not, and that's administrative adjudication. Executive orders, that's the president's power to issue an order to get an agency to do certain things. Red tape, that's all the documentation and procedures that you have to go through in order to get something done in a bureaucracy. The point of red tape is to make sure that the bureaucracies, agencies do what they're supposed to do. If you don't have red tape, then you have a situation where you have agents within the bureaucracy able to just kind of do what they want. So the purpose of the documentation is to make sure that policy is actually followed, to make sure the rules are followed. Plum book. These are top cabinet employee listings. They're not part of the merit system. General schedule. This is a salary guide. So if you're G1, you get paid less than if you're a G10. And the general schedule is attached to various jobs. Some jobs are G1 jobs, some jobs are G7 jobs, things like that. Department of Defense is the largest single employer of federal civilian workers by department or agency. Speaking of which, where do federal employees work? We look here, we see this is an interesting way to divide it. They have the U.S. Postal Service at 757,400. They have the executive branch employees, which includes the Department of Defense, at 69.6%. And then you look over your legislative, just 1.1%. Judicial, 1.3%. So 2.5% of bureaucrats work for the branches other than the executive branch.